Welcome to part 1 of another presentation. May I remind you that an illustrated PDF is available for the combined presentations of part 1 and 2 by following the link on the YouTube screen. This is a story about one queen, 2 paintings and 2 birds. One that doesn't exist and the other that looks nothing like what you'd expect. I have to declare an interest in ornithology, so the investigation holds particular interest for me. In particular, the ability to browse through very old publications of our feathered friends. I promise you that this is another very interesting tale, spanning some 3,000 years and involves some of the most eminent philosophers and zoologists of their time. Although the theme stems from the paintings, the scope is as usual very wide. So settle back and enjoy. This part deals principally with the phoenix and part 2 with the pelican. Here are the 2 paintings that we're considering, both of Elizabeth I. On the left is the so-called Pelican portrait and on the right is the Phoenix portrait. The artist was Nicholas Hilliard, who lived from 1547 to 1619. He painted them around 1575. He'd finished his apprenticeship in 1571 and during the next 40 years proved himself the supreme limner, in other words, painter of miniatures. At the end of his training there was little call for such paintings. There was, however, a market for portraits, both in England and Europe, and Hilliard hoped to fill this vacancy. Unfortunately, in the words of Roy Strong, the eminent art historian, his skill as a formal portrait painter was at best adequate. Notwithstanding, they are still very impressive pieces of work. If we compare the heads of the 2 images, you can see what Roy Strong means. There is virtually no facial detail and the eyes are dead, with no hint of highlights to breathe life into them. Just by adding these highlights to the eyes produces a dramatic effect. If we compare the face with the Hilliard's first miniature of the Queen painted a little earlier, the similarity is obvious. Perhaps the lack of detail was a reflection of his inexperience in painting on a larger scale, or perhaps it was because the work was not about the physical face of the monarch, it was about what she was wearing. Studies by the National Portrait Gallery in 2010 revealed that the wooden panels on which the portraits are painting originate from the same 2 oak trees. Infrared reflectograms show that the eyes and nose and the mouth of the Phoenix portrait were originally painted at a lower level. In fact, the 2 figures are exact mirror images of one another. In this image, the Phoenix portrait has been flipped horizontally and overlaid on the Pelican portrait with 50% opacity. The facial features are identical, as is the hand position. Differences in the image would have resulted in a fuzzy image. Just above the hand, the 2 elements which we're interested in overlap perfectly. Given the changes to the Phoenix portrait, it would seem that this one was painted first. If we return to the Phoenix portrait in more detail, we can see the extraordinary array of pearls, precious stones and gold on a background of black worked lace and gold stitched fabric. There is a necklace with a droplet pearl, and below there is a chain based on 3 Tudor roses, joined by settings of 5 pearls, rubies and black stones. From the central Tudor rose hangs a pendant. The Queen's waist appears to be cinched in by the pearls in a very unnatural way. She holds a red rose delicately between thumb and middle finger of an unadorned hand, and above this, right in the heart of the picture, is a phoenix. The bird has a red beak and a crest on its head. The tops of the wings are golden and the trailing edges of the wings and legs are crimson. It stands on its burning nest, the centre of which is a ruby set in gold, and which in turn is framed by the gold thread of the underlying garment, giving the appearance of the wood on a pyre. This is the first time the Queen was painted wearing a personal emblem. If we extract the chain from the background, this is what we see, an extraordinarily beautiful and complex design. The jewellery in the Pelican portrait is different. Gone is the heavier chain, to be replaced by a complex array of pearls, which you can see more clearly here. Once again there is a necklace, below which hangs a droplet pearl. The rectangular black stones are again much in evidence. The rose is there too, this time tucked into the bodice. There is a curious black thread around the neck, which seems to disappear behind the lace on top of the bodice. Once again, if we extract the design, you can see that there are 3 separate pearl necklaces. 2 are tucked in behind the bodice, and the 3rd is pinned to the dress so that it hangs in loops. The symbol of the pelican hangs from a jewelled cluster, itself attached to the top of the bodice. I do wonder if the black ribbon supports the weight of the jewellery. So this is what the paintings are all about, the phoenix and the pelican. Now we all know that the phoenix does not exist, and the pelican, which is shown pecking at its breast to feed its young on blood, bears no resemblance to the pelican we're used to. In fact, it looks remarkably like a phoenix with a somewhat longer neck. What are they meant to signify? Well, to answer that, in both cases we need to delve a long way back in history. If you saw my last presentation about the use of classical deities in presenting the Queen to the world, then you will be aware of the concept of using old ideas in new ways. Let's start with the phoenix, and to do that we need to go to Egypt. This is an artist's impression of the city of Heliopolis, which stood on the site of a modern suburb of Cairo. For more than 2,000 years it was the centre of sun worship in Egypt. The Temple of the Sun is the white pyramidal structure in the middle distance on the left. It was believed to have been built on the site of the creation of the world. The temple of Ra, the sun god, is shown inset, and in front of the temple stand 2 obelisks, one of which travelled to Italy, as we shall see shortly. Sadly, little remains of the city today, as you can see from this aerial photograph. The one remaining element is the Al-Masala obelisk, still in its original position, the oldest obelisk in the world. According to Egyptian mythology, here is the beginning of the world. The creator sun god, in the form of a Bennu bird, stands on a mound of land rising out of the primordial sea, divine light emerging from infinite darkness. The first cry from the Bennu's throat sets time in motion, and I'll explain how the bird came to be so named shortly. A series of texts recorded on pyramids, coffins and papyrus buried with the dead record the beliefs of the Egyptians through 3 kingdoms, spanning nearly 3,000 years. Here is the sun god Ra with his falcon head carrying on top of it a solar disk. The Bennu bird wears the feathered crown of Aphet, also known as Osiris. The Bennu bird, called Phoenix, was part of a complex array of interlinked gods. Ra, the sun god, is also Atum, who is also the Bennu bird, who is also Osiris. Chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead helps to explain this. I am Atum, I who was alone. I am Ra at his first appearance. I am that great phoenix which is in Heliopolis. Here is a sheet from chapter 17 of the Book of the Dead, in which Hunefer is paying homage to the Bennu. Now why, one might ask, would she be doing that? Well, Osiris Bennu was the undisputed god of the underworld. He'd been dismembered and scattered by his brother Seth, and his wife had put him back together again. Thereafter, Osiris Bennu became the god of resurrection, a link perhaps to the modern view of the phoenix. He is seen sitting on the right in judgment to one being led into the underworld. The assessment involved weighing the heart of the person against the weight of a feather in order to gain entry, hence the scales shown on the left. Now I can hear you say, that's not a phoenix, it's a heron. And of course you're quite right, it is. I was deliberately misleading you. How then did it get the name phoenix? Well, it was given it by the translators of the ancient documents, many of whom were looking back through several thousand years of history of the phoenix. As far as the Egyptians were concerned, it was a Bennu bird. Trust me, it gets even more confusing. Just to explain the top number on the slide, I've tried to simplify the timeline of the story by taking 0 as the birth of Christ. Anything before this is negative and afterwards is positive. If, as I do, you get confused when referring to the centuries, you can keep an eye on where you are. Now this man is Homer, esteemed author and poet who lived around 8 centuries BC. In his Iliad and Odyssey, the word phoenix was used to describe a date palm and the founder of Phoenicia. It was also described a purple or crimson colour like blood. Nowhere does it seem to describe a bird of that name. Herodotus was a Greek historian who lived between 484 and 425 BC. He spent his entire life working on just one project, an account of the origins and execution of the Greco-Persian Wars, that he called the Histories. They were written about 430 BC, and a fragment of which is shown on the right. He travelled widely collecting information, and Book 2 of his work details the history and culture of Egypt. He recorded the story of a sacred bird in Heliopolis, which he called the phoenix. Now, we might be expected him to describe a bird which tallies with the Bennu bird, but it didn't. Here is what he wrote. The Egyptians have a sacred bird called the phoenix, which I myself have never seen, except in pictures. Indeed, it is a great rarity even in Egypt, only coming there, according to the accounts of the people of Heliopolis, every 500 years when the old phoenix dies. Its size and appearance, if like the pictures, are as follows. The plumage is partly red, partly golden, while the general make and size are almost exactly that of an eagle. They tell the story of what this bird does, which does not seem to me to be credible, that he comes all the way from Arabia and brings the parent bird, all plastered over with myrrh, to the temple of the sun, and there he buries the body. In order to bring him, they say, he first forms a ball of myrrh as big as he finds he can carry. Then he hollows out the ball and puts his parent inside and covers the opening with fresh myrrh. And the ball is then exactly the same weight as the first, so he brings it to Egypt. Such is the story they tell of the doings of the bird. Now I think I can detect an element of scepticism here. However, the important phrase is like the pictures, which implies that he'd seen them. And one of the possible explanations is that Herodotus mistook a bird resembling an eagle, which he saw next to an image of the Bennu bird. Here, for example, is the tomb of Nefertiti, in which you can see there is a raptor shown next to a heron. It's fair to say that Herodotus did make a few errors elsewhere in his works when describing animals. The confusion still remains as to why he called the bird a phoenix, as he used the same word throughout his histories to describe Phoenicia, date palm, etc. In addition, his description does not include any descriptions of the births, death and reincarnation. That came later, in fact 450 years later. This is the Piazza del Popolo in Rome, and in the foreground is the Obelisco Flaminio, one of the 12 obelisks that were brought to Rome. This one was brought from Egypt and erected by the Emperor Augustus in 10 BC. Its original home was Heliopolis in Egypt, standing alongside its neighbour in front of the Temple of Ra. It was inscribed by the order of Ramses II 3,000 years ago. Following its journey across the Mediterranean, together with the obelisk of Montecitorio, it was taken to Rome and erected along the central spina of the Circus Maximus. In this drawing, the Flaminian obelisk has been dragged up a slope and is being raised into position with ropes slung over a wooden cage. The Montecitorio obelisk has already been raised in the distance. And here is a reconstruction of how it might have looked. Over the centuries, the obelisk fell and was buried. It was rediscovered following a comprehensive search in 1568, and after removal of a damaged section, it was raised in the Piazza del Popolo in 1589. Unfortunately, I've been unable to trace a picture of the entire hieroglyphs on the obelisk, but I was lucky enough to find a translation. That was carried out by this man, John Henry Parker, a very famous Egyptologist in his day, and was written up in a book in 1879 entitled 12 Egyptian Obelisks in Rome. Judging by the photographs from his book, the obelisk was not in good condition, and deciphering it must have been something of a challenge. And here is his translation of part of the centre column on the west side of the obelisk. The resplendent Horus, beloved of the sun, whose name is magnified. The king, Pharaoh, establisher of justice, who fills Heliopolis with obelisks, to illustrate with their rays the temple of the sun, who, like the phoenix, fills with good things the great temple of the gods. But here's the interesting thing. In the original text, the word phoenix is marked with an F. In the footnote, he writes, doubtful translation. And here is the probable explanation. Here is the hieroglyph for heron, taken from a book listing hieroglyphic signals. And here is the sequence which has been interpreted as phoenix. The letter B is signified by a lower leg, the letter N by water, the letter W by a chick. The picture of the bird is what we would call a heron. Together we have BNW, or Bennu bird. So it was not surprising that 3,000 years after it was engraved, John Parker might have been troubled in his mind about how this fitted in with his view of what a phoenix might look like. To the Egyptians, it was the Bennu bird. During Roman times, several authors wrote of the phoenix, including Pliny the Elder and Tacitus. Their efforts were written in prose, while the work of our old friend Ovid wrote his in verse in volume 15 of Metamorphoses, which, as you know, was a series of stories about the change of state of deities and animals. He was writing at around 20 to 10 BC. And here is his description. Reborn in ageless likeness through the years, it is that bird Assyrians call the phoenix, nor does it eat the common weeds and grasses, but drinks the juice of sweet burning herbs. When he has done 500 years of living, he winds his nest high up, a swaying palm, and delicate dainty claws prepare his bed, of bark and spices, myrrh and cinnamon, and dies while incense lifts his soul away. Then from his breast, or so the legend runs, a little phoenix rises over him, to live, they say, the next 500 years. Again, another slightly sceptical account. In Book 2 of Amores, as he muses about matters of love, he refers to the phoenix as unica semper avis, only one phoenix in the world at a time, a phrase that would be later picked up by 16th century writers. Now this man is Pliny the Elder, Roman author and naturalist, who published his Naturalis Historia shortly before being killed by the eruption at Mount Vesuvius. The work was translated, copied and illustrated many times, and even 1600 years later, after it was written, remained a valuable source work on natural history, both real and imaginary. Pliny discusses the phoenix at some length, drawing on earlier authors, again expressing doubt over its existence. He tells us that it was about the size of an eagle, with a crest on its head. It was coloured purple and gold around the neck, and the tail was blue with rose-coloured feathers. He also provides an explanation as to how the bird undergoes its metamorphosis. If you think about it, most images of the bird show it sitting on flames, leading to the concept that it is arising from them. It's not, of course, true. This is the immolation stage. To get around the awkward rebirth, Pliny describes the bird just dying on its nest, no fire needed. Then a maggot-like creature appears in the ashes, which then grows into a chick. How long this takes, or how it gets from a chick to a fully grown bird, is not clear. Other authors describe an intervening egg stage. So we should remind ourselves that the phoenix did not exist, and given that it only turned up every 500 years, it's remarkable how well it was described. It might just be that that description arose from this bird, an Asian or golden pheasant now widespread throughout the world. It hailed originally from China. It's conceivable that a stray known in the birdie world as an accidental turned up one time in Egypt and landed at the Temple of the Sun in Heliopolis, and the rest, as they say, is myth. Herodotus was the only person to have seen an image of the phoenix, and it was the Romans who provide us with the earliest pictorial representations. The gold coin is from 118 BC and commemorates Trajan, and on the reverse is the phoenix in the shape of the Bennu bird. Indeed, the Bennu link persisted for several hundred years, as is demonstrated by this mosaic floor in a 4th century church in Antioch. However, Roman writers assimilated the description of Ovid in both Greek and Latin texts. This is Pope Clement I, a contemporary of Peter and Paul. In 96 AD, he wrote his first letter to the Corinthians. Within this letter, he describes the phoenix and its rebirth exactly as described by previous classical writers. However, he follows it with an important paragraph. Do we then think it to be a great and marvellous thing if the Creator of the universe shall bring about the resurrection of them that served him with holiness in the assurance of good faith, seeing that he showeth to us even by a bird the magnificence of his promise? This was certainly the first record of the myth being used as the basis of resurrection of the followers of Christianity. The letter, not surprisingly, was greatly revered. This man is Lucius Cicilius Firmianus, also known as Lactantius, and this is a turning point in our story. He was an early Christian author who was appointed by the Emperor Constantine to advise on the adoption of Christianity by the Roman Empire. He also wrote a poem entitled De Ave Phoenice. It forms the transition from the classical to the medieval phoenix, and although based on pagan mythology, alludes to Christian death and rebirth. The poem was translated into English prose by J. and A. M. Duff in 1934. Unfortunately, there's no space here to explore it in detail. I have, however, included it in the PDF. Lactantius's description of the bird is a remarkable flight of fancy. I've done my best to colour the bird as he describes, and this is what he said. To begin with, her colour is like the colour which beneath the sunshine of the sky-ripe pomegranates cover under their rind, like the colour in the petals of the wild poppy when Flora displays her garb at the blush of dawn. In such a dress gleam her shoulders and comely breast, even so glitter head and neck and surface of the back, while the tail spreads out variegated with a metallic yellow, amid whose spots reddens a purple blend. The wing feathers are picked out by a contrasting sheen, as 'tis the heaven-sent rainbow's way to eliminate the clouds. The beak is of a fine white with a dash of emerald green, glittering jewel-like in its clear horn as it opens. You would take for two twin sapphires those great eyes, from between which shoots a bright flame. All over its head is fitted with a crown of rays, in lofty likeness of the glory of the sun-god's head. Scales cover the legs, which are variegated with a metallic yellow, but the tint which colours the claws is a wonderful rose. To the eye it has a blended semblance between the peacock's appearance and the rich-hued bird from Phasis. Phasis refers to a member of the pheasant family. Around 200 BC, a text was written in Alexandria entitled Physiologus. Although often translated as the Naturalist, it was an account of animals, each with a religious interpretation. No originals of the text survived, but it was widely copied in Greek and then into Latin with the addition of illustrations, and that's why I'm mentioning it at this stage. This version was published in Antwerp in 1588, and on page 42 it contains an illustration of the phoenix, accompanied by an overt Christian message in both Latin and Greek. It seems to have taken on the form of a farmyard animal somewhere akin to a turkey, and the text says, "If now this bird has the power to slay himself and come back to life again, how should reasonable men complain of our Lord Jesus Christ when he said, 'I have the power to lay down my life and take it again'?" The link between the phoenix bird and Christianity began to filter into early Christian art. Here's an example of a mosaic showing Adam and the phoenix in Apamea, a church in Syria. Even so, this is still very much a Bennu bird. As the centuries passed, Physiologus evolved into bestiaries. These were collections of short descriptions about all sorts of animals, real and imaginary, accompanied by a moralizing explanation. Here are 2 pages from the Aberdeen Bestiary, which is thought to have been created in the 12th century. It depicts the phoenix with a description of its resurrection linked to a strong Christian message. "Let this bird teach us, therefore, by its own example, to believe in the resurrection of the body. Lacking both an example to follow and any sense of reason, it reinvents itself with the very signs of resurrection, showing that without doubt that the bird exists as an example to man. Who but the Creator tells the phoenix that the day of death has come?" The image on the left illustrates the death of the phoenix, and on the right the resurrection. Purely as pieces of art, the images are of great beauty, making heavy use of gold leaf and bright colours. This is an image from the Northumberland Bestiary of the same period. There is a slight variation of the story here, as on this occasion the phoenix appears to have a helper which is stoking the fire. This takes us on to emblem books. Now, the coming of the Renaissance led to an explosion of references to the phoenix, both in art and literature. Since the time of Ovid, the uniqueness of the bird had been understood, and it became a metaphor for unique and outstanding individual. Several times on our journey we've come across emblem books, wildly popular in both England and Europe in the 16th century. Here's a page from Anno's 1552 book. It's entitled The Eternity of God. In the engraving, the phoenix is set on fire by the rays of the sun, igniting its nest. And here is the text. They say that the phoenix of Arabia, alone of all birds, lives innumerable thousands of years. Born from herself, the restorable bird, she dies being born, and dying is reborn. For as the setting sun licks her with its fire, she is born and remade from her flames. Do we believe this? Or do we think what foreign license dares speak in the tale as empty myth? We believe it, and surely beneath the image of the bird is the phoenix himself, the one God, who lives eternally, who takes his beginning from himself and dissolves himself and is always rising by the fire of his own radiance. Some dignitaries began to incorporate the phoenix into their own impresi. This one from Giovanni Battista Pittoni, Book of Impresi, published in 1568, illustrates the impresa of Cristoforo Madruccio, Cardinale di Trento. Note the letters V-E-V, short for Eterna Vita Vive, eternal life lives, and under the bird the words ut vivat, so that he might live. Sometimes the emblems were used to reflect current or recent events. This text is from one of Bézé's books, Écon, and it reads as follows. For if they speak true, death itself remakes the phoenix, with the effect that one fire is life and death for this bird. Go, O executioners, burn the holy bodies of the saints. To those you want to destroy, the flame gives life. And this is a direct reference to burning of Protestants in France. This is a curious one from Boissard, published in 1588, and is entitled To the Physician Jacques de Saint-Aubin. Virtue lives on after death. A goddess sits opposite a burning phoenix in a destroyed mountain landscape. On the shield is written, Virtue is the greatest shield for mortals. At the base of the pyre are the words, In virtue there is enough defence for living well and happily. Being free of death, virtue is immortal. And the main text underneath reads, After the phoenix burns among the sweet-smelling amomum, that's a spice, perhaps cardamom, the little bird emerges from the extinguished fire. So fairest virtue restores eternal reputation from the end of death for her follower. Now this man is Joachim Camerarius the Younger, who lived from 1534 to 1598. He was a German doctor and botanist. The most famous of all his works were the creeds and emblems of the century, of which he composed the 3 centuries of plants, quadrupeds and birds. And here is the front page. You will note at the top, on the left, we have a phoenix with a pelican feeding her young on the right. And here is an extensive section, beginning again with ut vivat, so that he may live. The text below the picture of the phoenix translates as, Born from herself, the restorable bird, she dies being born, and dying is reborn, taken directly from Anno's Emblem, published 40 years previously. Now, printers were not slow to see a good logo when they saw one. In particular, this man. This is Gabriele Giolito di Ferrari, who was an Italian printer active in Venice. He was the first of the major publishers in the vernacular Italian language, rather than Latin, and lived from 1508 to 1575. This is one version of his printer's mark from 1552. A phoenix aflame under the rays of the sun, his initials emblazoned on the globe below. Interesting, of course, is the motto, Semper Eadem, always the same, later to be used by Elizabeth I. And here he's used it to great effect on the cover of Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, which has nothing whatsoever to do with phoenixes, except, of course, to advertise the printer. Here is another version, eternal, but by my death the life I live. Ever the same. Always there, dependable and unique. An adman's dream, and indeed it still is. In any account of the phoenix emblem, it's important to consider this man, Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch was one of Italy's most famous writers, who lived from 1304 to 1374. Lauded with having invented the name Renaissance, he is famous for developing the sonnet format, which was widely copied thereafter. His work, Canzoniere, literally songbooks, was written in the vernacular Italian. The central theme is an unrequited love for a woman named Laura, who was married and rejected his advances. The reason for telling you this is that he uses the image of the phoenix to describe her. The identity of Laura is uncertain, but the principal candidate is Laura de Noves. This is poem 185, in which he describes her. Questa fenice delorata piume, this phoenix with golden plumage. This phoenix with golden plumage round her lovely neck, noble and white, seems to have formed a dear necklace by which all hearts are softened, mine consumed, in the form of a natural diadem that lights the air all around, and the silent furnace of love draws a subtle liquid fire from there that warms me in the most ungentle weather. A purple covering with a sky-blue hem, scattered with roses, covers the lovely creature, a novel dress, a rare and singular beauty. Report places her and hides her in the rich and scented vales of Arabian hills, who flies in truth so nobly through the skies. Sadly, Laura died young, probably of the plague, and Petrarch continued to write about her afterwards. This is part of poem 323, which is entitled Standomi un giorno solo alla finestra, one day standing alone at a window. I saw a strange phoenix, both its wings clothed in crimson, and its head with gold, solitary and alone in the wood. I first thought its form heavenly and immortal to the sight, till it reached the uprooted laurel, and the fountain that the earth had swallowed. All things fly towards their end. Seeing the leaves scattered on the ground, and the broken trunk, and that dry spring, it turned its beak on itself, almost disdainfully, and in a moment vanished, so that my heart burns with pity and love. The death of the phoenix is, of course, a metaphor for the passing of Laura. Many poets have been inspired by this poem to produce their own translation. These rather acrobatic illustrations appear in Clement Marot's 1533 work entitled Visions de Petrarch. 200 years after Petrarch, Sir Philip Sidney, poet, soldier and diplomat, wrote his own sonnet sequence dedicated to Stella, universally recognised as Lady Penelope Rich. He died as a result of injuries sustained in the Battle of Zutphen in 1586. He makes just a passing reference to Stella as Phoenix in Sonnet 92, when he says, while asked after Stella, when I demand of Phoenix Stella's state, you say, forsooth, you left her well of late. There's no explanation as to why he refers to her in this way. During his life he was not referred to as Phoenix. This changed, however, after his death. In 1593 a compilation of poems was published by a Mr. R.S. under the title of The Phoenix Nest. The phoenix referred to is almost certainly Sir Philip Sidney, as there are 2 dedicatory verses to him in the front of the book. The collection of poems by the most talented writers of the time is metaphorically built up as the nest on which the phoenix, i.e. Sir Philip Sidney, died, never to be revived. In the first of these, an elegy to Astrophil, the name taken by Sidney in his sonnet sequence, birds including an eagle, a turtle dove, a swan and a phoenix gather in a tree to mourn his loss. The phoenix is described thus: "And that which was of wonder most, the phoenix left sweet Araby, and on a cedar in this coast built up her tomb of spicery, as I conjecture by the same, prepared to take her dying flame. The general sorrow that was made among the creatures of kind fired the phoenix where she laid, her ashes flying with the wind, so as I might with reason see that such a phoenix ne'er should be." So that brings us on to the relationship of the royals to the phoenix. Closer to Elizabeth's time, the phoenix was used by members of the royalty of England and overseas. These are the heraldic devices of the Seymour family, and in particular Jane Seymour, wife of Henry VIII and mother of Edward VI. The motto of the family being "bound to obey and serve." We clearly have a phoenix wearing a crown on its nest above a castle with the roses of York and Lancaster. The same theme is taken up by the stained glass window at the Church of St. Thomas, Noak Hill. This is Eleanor of Austria, sister of Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, and wife of Francois I of France. She had the motto of the phoenix with the epithet "non est similis illi," there is nothing like her, meaning that the sister of Charles V and the wife of Francois had no equal in happiness or fortune. When Francois died in 1547, she later changed the motto to "Unica semper avis," possibly to signify she wished to remain single. It even reached the Emblem books. This 1577 sheet from a Paradin book mentions her by name as the Dowager Queen of France. Now we know from our previous travels how much the Elizabethan court was impressed by both Charles V and Francois I, so the use here may have had an influence on it being adopted by Queen Elizabeth. This is a famous painting of Mary of Guise, the French mother of Mary Queen of Scots. Her coat of arms is displayed in the top right-hand corner. If we look more closely, we have a unicorn on one side and a phoenix on the other, wearing a crown around its neck. The sentiment was passed on to her daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, who worked this piece in around 1570 while incarcerated by Elizabeth I. Note the initials M.R., Mary Regina, alongside the bird's head. So we've explored the myth of the phoenix and how it developed through the centuries as a useful device for a number of individuals and organisations. What about its use by, or indeed for, Elizabeth I? Well, there she is. The painting was created in 1575, some 17 years into her reign, and is the first depiction of the Queen in any form of personal emblem. In a perfect sense, Elizabeth was ideal for the use of the phoenix emblem. As I've discussed in earlier presentations, she was very vulnerable as a lone female ruler, clinging to a religion hated by the powers of Europe. An element of mysticism, just as her association with the classical goddesses elevated her powers to a high level. One can assume that the painting was displayed at court in Westminster to be viewed by courtiers and foreign dignitaries alike. Here was an almost supernatural woman, displaying fabulous wealth, and at her heart the phoenix, signalling all that it imbued. The design of the chain from which the emblem hung reflected those worn by her father, reinforcing her position as his true successor. So what could those looking at the painting read from it? Firstly, she was head of the church, and Christian associations of the phoenix emblems reinforce this. Secondly, she was the unica semper regina, only one queen at a time. Thirdly, the phoenix was associated with chastity. Fourthly, the long life of the bird chimed with her already long reign. Fifthly, there was a message of immortality, not just of herself, but for what she'd achieved during her reign. Unspoken, of course, was the continuation of the Tudor line, and there was the problem. It was not only the paintings which displayed the image of the Queen. She had a court workshop which produced a series of miniature cameos and relief portraits, some of which contained the phoenix emblem. Here is the so-called phoenix jewel, fashioned at about the same time as the painting. Elizabeth is shown in relief on one side, and on the obverse side being engulfed in flames as a phoenix. Here is a silver badge, cast at a similar time and expressing the same sentiments. And this is the chequers ring, one of the few surviving items that was actually worn by the Queen, so named because it lives at Chequers, the grace and favour home of the British Prime Minister. It is a mother-of-pearl locket ring with an image of the Queen and probably her mother Anne Boleyn inside. The E is made of diamonds and the R of blue enamel. There is a single pearl, and both this and the ring is encircled with rubies. On the inside is a gold and enamel image of a phoenix rising from an earl's coronet. As we've seen, this was the symbol of the House of Seymour, and it's thought to be a gift to the Queen from the family in an attempt to gain favour with her. Well, the references to Elizabeth as Phoenix in contemporary literature would fill a whole presentation. I want to concentrate on just one, for the reasons I'll explain shortly. This is the front page of a book entitled Love's Martyr, or Rosalind's Complaint. It's important in that there is a section at the end in which prominent poets were asked to compose on the topic of the phoenix and the turtle dove. One of these was William Shakespeare. It's not a long poem. It describes the death by fire of the phoenix and its faithful lover. It is, of course, an allegory, and the issue is the identity of those described. I will read just 2 verses from it. Verse 1. Let the bird of loudest lay, that means song, on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be, to whose sound chaste wings obey. Verse 8. Hearts remote, yet not asunder, distance and no space was seen, twixt this turtle and his queen, but in them it were a wonder. There follows a threnos, which is a lyrical lament for the dead. Beauty, truth and rarity, grace in all simplicity, here enclosed in cinders lie. Death is now the phoenix nest, and the turtle's loyal breast to eternity does rest, leaving no posterity. 'Twas not their infirmity, it was married chastity. Truth may seem but cannot be, beauty brag, but it is not she. Truth and beauty buried be. To this urn let those repair that are either true or fair, for these dead birds sigh a prayer. And just on the slide, please note the spelling of Shakespeare with a hyphen. And the point, of course, is that the phoenix does not rise up. It's the end. Now I'd like to take you back to the very start of my journey, to the painting in Hampton Court by Marcus Gerhardt the Younger from around 1600, now labelled Unknown Woman, but for centuries labelled as Elizabeth I. Here we have an Arabian tree, the walnut. We have an overpainted songbird at the top, which looks very much like a nightingale, and we know that originally there were birds in the sky which have now been overpainted. On the front panel of the dress there are 5 phoenixes, 2 perched and 3 aflame, all equally spaced and in a perfect vertical line. There is something else which I didn't spot originally, and it's this. Each phoenix is framed by 4 convex curves in the underlying scroll of leaves. You can see them in the enlarged images on the right. At the centre of the circles made by the scroll, another element of the design, usually a flower, sits. This geometrical design with the phoenixes in the centre convinces me that they are a very important message in the painting. What might that be? Well, my current thought is this: there is only one phoenix at a time, so it must represent a sequence of 5. Now, there were 5 members of the Tudor line, and by 1600 it was obvious that it would be extinguished. The poem in the cartouche of the painting tells the same story. Surely the poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle Dove, is alluding to the same topic. If the subject of the painting is Queen Elizabeth, then who is the faithful dove who will turn to ashes with her? Well, I think that in the painting he's represented as the stag, silenced, and whose name would be buried where his body lies. I believe this to have been Edward de Vere, also known as William Shakespeare. Now, following the death of the Queen, the propaganda machine had a new focus. This is Joshua Sylvester, an English poet who lived from 1563 to 1618. In 1605, 2 years after the Queen's death, he published his translation of the Weeks and Works of Guillaume du Bartas, a French courtier and poet of great standing who was friendly with James VI of Scotland. And here is one of the Corona Dedicatoria at the beginning of the work, and just bear with me here, this is relevant. If we enlarge the bottom part of the picture, then the section reads thus: "In whom the beauties of the first return from spicy ashes of the sacred urn. Of our dead phoenix, dear Elizabeth, a new true phoenix lively flourished, whom greater glories than the first adorn, so much, O King, they sacred worth presume. James, thou art just heir of England's joyful union, so not just the same phoenix, but an even better one." The phoenix symbol is now ubiquitous, such that hardly anyone thinks of its origins or meaning. There is, however, one use which I feel is most apt. This is the La Fenice Opera House in Venice, and she probably gathered La Fenice is the Italian word for phoenix. Hanging just over the entrance is the bird itself. The building has been destroyed by fire 3 times in 1774, 1836 and 1996, being restored to its former glory on each occasion. I can't think of a more apt name for it. Well, that's the end of part 1 of this account. What have we learned? Well, out of the myth of an ancient bird which lived for 500 years and then renewed itself with fire, grew many interpretations of its meaning. Early writers who described its life were sceptical of its existence. The Bennu bird of Egypt became the eagle-like creature of Rome. The principle of resurrection was picked up by early Christian scholars to draw in converts to the religion. Even 1600 years later, the characteristic of the bird, uniqueness and immortality, remained a powerful force with which to imbue a monarch. So please watch part 2 to find out the story behind the pelican. Many thanks for watching.